Tonight we'd like to welcome composer Sheng. Bright is one of the most distinguished and important composers living in America today. And this piece he finished for us, I think it was this year, and we premiered it at the Phillips Collection in Washington, which was co-commissioner. Michigan State commissioned it and the Phillips Collection. And as I say, tonight's our first performance at Michigan State. Bright, I'd like to start out by asking you something about the composition process. How do you start to write a piece? Are you one of the composers that has a schedule 8 to 12 or whatever, or do you wait for inspiration? If you don't mind, I would be very interested to find out something about that.
Well, in my case, it's always difficult. Everything I do is difficult. Nothing comes easy and cheaply in my case. And so I try to get inspirations whenever I can. Whenever I get, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in real, sometimes you do things when you're not expected. That inspiration came in. I would drop everything and just make sure that I remember the inspirations. And I try to keep a writing schedule. I think the best time is always in the morning. Get up in the morning. The first 4 hours after you get up, that's your mind is clear and you can concentrate. So normally, like this summer, I've been working on my opera, and every day I get up and I try to work, a good chunk of time to get things done. And I think that's very good. But most importantly, I think for a composition is really you need to have your thought on the piece all the time. And the idea will come. You can't just say, oh, okay, now these 4 hours I'm going to write, and the next 4 hours I'm going to think about something else. And you have to constantly think about it when you eat, when you do other things. So sometimes we act like we're spaced out. Very often we're thinking about something else. It's not because we spaced out. We spaced out anyway. I spaced out anyway. But I think that's probably the situation.
That's very interesting. One question I always ask our composers is how you think of the personality of the three instruments. The violin, of course, and the clarinet and the piano as individual instruments, and then also how do you regard the personality of the whole group as a unit, as opposed to something where you have the cello instead of the clarinet?
Yeah, I think when, for example, with your trio, I listened to a lot of tapes that you sent me, and I tried to figure out the personality of each players. And I know the violinist and the clarinetist are married. So, for example, the second movement is just a little duet for the two of you. I thought it would be nice just to do it without the piano. And I think it helps me a great deal if I know the player or the orchestra. When I write for an orchestra, for example, I would like to know the sound of this orchestra and hear them performing. But ideally, if I had worked with them before, like if they have done a piece of mine before, or you have played a piece of mine before. Unfortunately, I didn't have another trio in this formation. So I think that helps. It does help a great deal, because then I try to, I think each player, there's something special about this person. The reason they become a professional musician, there's something special about this person. And then as a group, also they have a character. So if I can try to highlight the character, and it always helps, I think.
That's very interesting. So you're actually maybe influenced more by the players than by just the instruments.
Well, instruments too, but I think it's sometimes, for example, I wrote a piano trio, and I worked very closely with the three players, and I noticed, for example, the cellist is very good technically, probably the most virtuoso. So I wrote the cello part really hard. in the piano trio, and so forth. So accordingly, and I think that feels write for the trio to play. But then another trio picked up. They said, "Why did you write so hard a cello part?" So you never know. And now I'm writing. I'm a pianist. Every time I write a piano part, I want to make sure it's something I one day can play myself. I don't have to say I can't play this. It has to be a real, a real pianist. So the piano part, my piano part is hard. It is. Like I'm practicing the piano concerto I wrote 2 years ago, and it is a very hard piece. But I think when I was writing, I had it in mind. I said I cannot go beyond the capability of myself as a pianist. But as a pianist, a lot of great pianists out there can do much better than what I can do. But that's sort of the rule I made. So I think there is some limitation you can have to, as a composer, you have to set up when you write a piece. And also you have to think about how often you want this piece to be played. And in the opera I'm working on, there's a major role, it's a baritone, Verdi baritone. And normally the Verdi baritone, it goes to G, high note is a G. But this baritone we hope to hire is very good. He had A. So I was tempted to write A and A flat. But then I thought, how often then if he's not singing this role, and later on, there are baritones can sing an A, but there are fewer than the one that cannot sing, than the one that can sing the G.
Maybe put an Ossia part.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Could you tell us about the musical elements that you used in creating Tibetan dance? The first movement, the prelude, the second movement, the song, and the third movement, the Tibetan dance. You had mentioned also that you lived near the Tibetan border when you were a child, I think, yes, and you worked there in a musical group. And I'm wondering, did that have some influence on our piece, the Tibetan dance?
Oh yes, this Tibetan, the last movement is called, of course, it's called the Tibetan dance, and the basic music material is from a dance from that region that I lived, called the Qinghai province. Qinghai was a part of Tibet. Goes back a few hundred years. It was part of Tibet. So the majority of population in Qinghai, I think still is Tibetan. It used to be called Eastern Tibet. The part now we call Tibet in Chinese is called Xizang. Xizang means Western Tibet. So Qinghai province used to be called Eastern Tibet. So it is part of Tibet in a larger sense. That's why there's a debate always, about which part of China, which part of Tibet, and all that. Because in the history, it goes back and forth many times. But that part, there are a lot of Tibetans. So the Tibetan culture is slightly different with the Western Tibet, because they was isolated by this huge mountain in between of them. But the music, for example, there's a basic dance, pum pum pum, tum 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 tum. It's like it's like the mazurka, the mazurka. You have this Chopin bam 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 dam dam dam. So it's the 3/4. The second beat is always the strong beat, right? Bam dam dam dam. And I didn't understand. Growing up playing a lot of, I know that's supposed to be an accent and all that. Until I went to Poland and I saw mazurka dance live. They bam dam dam dam. They have the foot do that. It's the same thing with the Tibetan. Then dum 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 dum. And there's a foot. And the Tibetans dance with they call the knuckle bells. Not knuckle bells. What do you call it? Ankle bells, right? Ankle bells, and they wear on their foot, and they dance with it. So I try to bring out that rhythm. So bum 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 bum. That rhythm is a basic rhythm, and the tune also. Da 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 da. That's a very Tibetan sort of typical Tibetan melody. Of course, I wrote the melody, but it's very.
It's in character.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about the first movement, the prelude? Does that have any connection with Tibet, or
Well, that is more. That first movement actually is more a abstract kind of feeling. It's sort of like, because this, I lived in this area more than 20 years ago. When I was writing this piece, that was before I get a chance to actually visit this place again. I recently visited the place again after 20-some years. So it was a long process of it's a memory from distant memory. So it's like gradually sort of helped me to become, the first movement is abstract, gradually soft. It's just very distant and atmospheric. And gradually, the second movement, you bring a very simple duet and tune, and based on the Chinese folk song, called the Cabbage. And then the Tibetan Dance, which is the main movement, very long and longest, and it's it sort of has a very strong and up to the front kind of character. So there was this group from Qinghai called the Provincial Qinghai Folk Dance and Music Troupe. Came to Shanghai to audition for young people. And so I auditioned for them with my little piano skill, and they took me, and I lived there for 7 years. And so I mean, looking back those 7 years, there are two things that are very good, actually, came out from. One is I became very familiar with the folk music there. I noticed that I was the best pianist in the whole province, not because I was very good, because the rest of them were very, very bad. Only few actually could play the piano, but were very bad. So I thought I should educate myself, which is, that means I couldn't get a teacher there. So I practiced on my own, and I developed a habit of sort of stealing from others, watching other people do and try to imitate, or listen to the tapes and try to imitate yourself, or take a lesson once a year from major cities with some professors and digest a whole year, that type of thing. And very vigorous and determined and driven kind of way of learning. I think which is sort of a common situation in China. For my generation, we all starved for knowledge because we were deprived from it. But then, so these two things, the folk music and that became, and self-taught kind of habit became very important to me. And after the Cultural Revolution, after Mao died, and the Madam Mao was trialed and put in prison, and the university started to reopen, and as you know, you went to China at the time, and I went back to Shanghai Conservatory, which is in the city that I was born. I went back. By then, I went back as a composer because I was a performer over there. I was a pianist, I was a percussionist, and I conducted and all that. So I went back and as a composer, and then I came to the United States after college and went for graduate school in New York City. But I had very good teacher in New York, but one important influence was Leonard Bernstein.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. I'm very interested in your some of the teachers that you had. Was Leonard Bernstein a major musical influence on you? Was he an influence in terms of being a composer who inspired you? And who are some of the other composers that you perhaps looked up to, learned from, and who were an inspiration to you? Also, is there any living composer that you regard as an influence on your work?
Well, I thought composition was easy. Little did I know. I thought all you need to do is come up with a good tune. And I always felt something that I could say, and I probably could say better than most of the people. And I think as any performer, at one point or other, is always had a temptation of being a composer at one time, and of being a conductor at the same, the other times. I think everybody had a temptation of fool around with these things, and I did fool around a little bit, but then I seriously thought about it. It was after the Cultural Revolution. I felt the political situation was open, and at the time it was a time of learning, and I think as a composer, for some reason I just felt that that's supposed to be the thing I supposed to do. I don't know. To this day, I sometimes wonder whether I made the right choice or not. But, on the other hand, what else can I do?
Sounds like you made the right choice. All right. And also fascinating to hear about Leonard Bernstein. Of course, he's such a great musical figure. And how did you get to meet him, and what kind of influence? Did you actually study composition with him?
Well, I met him first at Tanglewood. I was a student at Tanglewood, and he was, of course, a maestro, came every year and to work with the students. And we invited him to have sessions with us. So we, get to know each other. And he, in turn, invited all of us who were living in New York at the time to attend all his rehearsals.
With the Philharmonic.
Well, actually, he was rehearsing in New York with the New York Philharmonic, as well as other orchestras like Israel Philharmonic, because he was so big. They would have the orchestra come to New York to work with him, rather than he goes to Israel. They would come here 3 days early or something to work with him, to rehearse with him, or the three Philharmonics, the New York Philharmonic, the Israeli Philharmonic, and the Vienna Philharmonic, and so. And gradually I get to know him, and of course I officially asked him to be my teacher, and he accepted it. He said, but I can't give you weekly lessons because I don't know. I said, that's whenever you can, but so he did. Whenever he was in New York, I was always around him. Every time he was in New York, I was around him.
And you showed him your composition?
Oh, I showed him. He showed me his compositions. I showed him, yeah. And but more than that, I went to all his rehearsals, and performances. Went to, like I remember one time he had 2 weeks. He had 8 Mahler second performances with the New York Philharmonic, and I was every night.
Really?
Yeah, that was a quiet experience, and things like that. I think it was very important. After I met him in '85. I stayed. Until the last day. I was the last, actually, on the day he died, I visited him.
Really?
Yeah, and so he later he started to play my music, and he started to commission me to write pieces. I worked him. He hired me to do other kind of, piano as an assistant. But at the beginning, I was a student, and we took lessons, conducting lessons, and a composition. He didn't take piano lessons, but he did hear me play the piano, and he would give few comments. He said, "I'll play the Bach." He said, "Oh, I would bring out this line a little more here and there." It was just he would be taking a shower or eating breakfast or somewhere, or eating lunch somewhere, and he would hear me play. He said, "Play something," then I would play. So I wasn't the only one around. There was very talented young conductors. But I was the only composer actually around.
Really?
Very interesting. I wonder why. To this day I still don't understand why not other composers, because
maybe he wasn't known as a composition teacher. He was known as a composer, but primarily as a conductor. So maybe
that probably has something to do with that. Because also I think at the time he was not terribly respected in the academy composition world.
That's right, because his compositions, he would play avant-garde things, but his own music was not avant-garde.
Yeah, it was all, yeah. And that's one part. And also, I think he told me he never studied composition with anyone. He studied conducting with Fritz Reiner, a lot of famous teachers, Koussevitzky and all that. But he never studied composition. He said the closest to his teacher was Copland, who would give him comments. But I don't think he needed to study. He's a genius.
Of course.
So he felt, he said, I don't know how to teach composition, but I can tell you what my instinct is. So I think that was all I need. But I think I learned a great deal, not only through each composition that I wrote, but in general as a musicianship. And relearn the traditional. I think he was the one really introduced me to understand the traditional repertoire, for me to make the connection between what I'm writing and what Beethoven was doing, or Mozart was doing, or Bach was doing. Most composers is missing this link. Most of them think that if you're 20th century composers, you don't have to know. I mean, you know a little bit from college. Required theory courses, but how much you link those, how much you understand Beethoven's thinking, and how much do you think your thinking is the same thinking, is rooted in that tradition. I think that's, I think myself writing in different languages, right? But I'm basically the thinking I think is the same, because we're all human. We all appreciate certain things,
That's what makes it attractive to people all over the world and possible
Yeah.
to understand. We're almost out of time, I'm sorry
Okay.
to say. I have a question. Do you think China is becoming a major musical force? How do you see music evolving there? Classical music, I say that in quotes, serious music is evolving. Is it becoming an important factor in the development of young people? Are the audiences growing? I mean, you have so many, produced so many wonderful instrumentalists and some composers too, but what can you say to that?
I think it eventually will, but the government doesn't give a lot of funding. It's actually during the Cultural Revolution they gave a lot of funding. Everything was government supported, but now the funding in the arts is very limited. But they are developing, and there are two pretty good orchestras in Beijing now, and one is reorganizing in Shanghai. I think eventually, when the spiritual life, so to speak, which is arts, appreciation of arts and literature and stuff, will come after the people resolving the problem of having enough food on their table, which they already done a lot better than 20 years ago, but they still not quite got rid of that. So I think you're looking at other Asian countries, Japan or Taiwan, and there was one time there was a huge audience, classical music, but there's only for a time, and then the audience becomes sagged back because once they knew what it's about, and then the people were really devoted to, which is always a small core of people. But I think for China that hasn't happened yet. So there will be a wave of craze about classical music once China is economically became really strong, and they will have first-rate orchestras and conductors, artists performing there. I think that classical music will eventually become a very strong statement, and will have a lot of support from the average people.
The public.
Yeah, public. And then after maybe 10, 20 years, they will fade back, and eventually become something like here. So you have always a devoted audience here, and then you have always people that couldn't care less. It's like a museum. Certain people, it's a small population, percentage of population visits the museum. You can't expect that tomorrow we have everybody will visit the museum.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was great. It was great.